Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra Barcelona, U.S. Marketing Manager at Varnish Software, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar, Considerations When Deploying a Hybrid or Multi-CDN Strategy, featuring Dan Rayburn and Sling, presented by Varnish. Before we get started, I'll go through a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone who registered after the webinar. We'll also be sharing with you our survey findings document later on this week. Last, we'll be doing a live Q&A with our panel at the end of the session. So along the way, if you have any questions, just submit them into the questions panel on your screen. And then with that, I will hand it over to today's moderator, Dan Rayburn, for introductions and to get us started. So Dan, if you'd like to take it away.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Appreciate Varnish allowing me to come and present some data that I collected with them. And we know that there's a lot of webinars taking place right now, and we appreciate the time that we have with you today. And we're going to try and answer as many questions of yours as we can. We're going to keep this pretty short. We only have a couple slides. We want to keep the webinar to about 30 to 35 minutes. So let me introduce today's speakers real quickly. I'll be the moderator. I am a principal analyst at Frost & Sullivan, and many of you probably know me from my blog at streamingmediablog.com, and also as the chairman of the NAB Show Streaming Summit. The two speakers we have today with me are Chris Lin, who's infrastructure manager at Sling TV, and also Guillaume Quintard, who's the lead pre-sales engineer at Varnish Software. So with that, let's just jump right into what we're going to discuss today. So a few weeks ago, we went out to 100 customers in the broadcast, media, publishing, and OTT segments of the market, and we asked them a long list of questions pertaining to their multi-CDN strategy. And we've highlighted in the next couple slides some of the main key takeaways and points of all the questions we asked. But as was mentioned in the beginning, you're going to be able to download PDF of all the questions and all the answers at the end of the webinar. That's going to be put on the website soon. So you'll get a follow-up email from that because we want you to be able to get all the information. So what we did is we picked the ones that we thought were most important. I think it's also important to point out that the survey was done during COVID issues that we all have going on right now. So it's interesting to see some data pre-COVID and then during COVID. So what we're going to talk about today is what are some of the strategies, what are some of the challenges that people are having in terms of implementing a multi-CDN strategy or a hybrid strategy. What are some of the things they need to know more about? So some people haven't implemented one either because they don't know how they can, or they don't know who it's a good fit for customer-wise or size of customer. So what we wanted to do with the survey was really provide some information to the market on what are the different ways that you can deploy video with a good QoE, quality of experience. And it's not a one-size-fits-all model. So it's great that we've got Chris from Sling TV here today, real-world customer, doing video delivery, obviously for a lot of live content primarily, but I'll let Chris talk a little bit more about that. And then Guillaume is going to be talking more on what are some of the challenges that he's seeing from customers who are calling in and saying, I want to have more control, cost, or flexibility options over a multi-CDN strategy. So with that overview, let's just jump into the first survey question that we wanted to highlight. So we wanted to know specific to video delivery, which is what all these questions are about. It's not about software downloads or web optimization or cloud security services. It's all specific to video delivery, live and on demand. We asked if they were using an Origin Shield to protect your multi-CDN strategy. So are you using an Origin Shield product to actually protect the way you're doing multi-CDN to begin with? So interesting to see how this was really split up here. 25% of everybody said they weren't using one, but were considering it. 18% almost said they currently had one in production. Another almost 27% said, yes, they have one, but they're still implementing it. So you can see that there's only 20% with no plans to deploy and 11% that said they don't have the need. So the takeaway here is 70% of the customers we surveyed are either considering it, using it, or still implementing it. So with a little bit of that data to start the conversation, Chris, let me jump into you real quickly. As a end user customer and somebody who's delivering a lot of live streaming in particular, what were some of the things that you guys looked at from a best practices standpoint when it came to the different ways that you could deliver video with great quality across multiple CDNs.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, before I answer that question, I want to first say my observation when I first saw this chart was very much it has to matter depending on the scale of the person who's answering this question. Because anybody who's delivering at scale, I'd be shocked if they're not doing at least some form of origin shield or tiered caching or something like that, because it really is such a good thing. Now, to answer your question, we looked at the scale and the availability. So first you rule out all of the obvious things, like do they offer services in the geographies that you support, and so that narrows it down. And then can they handle the scale, and then the last part, and then the price of course plays in, and then the performance. So we have a minimum performance level that we require from each of our CDNs and whatever solution they use to provide that. And as long as they meet that minimum performance, then we let the clients choose whichever one is performing best for them, and we have a dial that allows us to adjust cost. So those are the factors that we use when we try to determine. And at any given time, we have between 3 and 5 CDNs that we're using. And depending on who's performing best on any given hour or day, because every CDN we've ever worked with has had issues. They all have a bad day now and again. And these types of the multi-CDN strategy is what saves us and our customers, because we can easily jump from one to the next.
Has your methodology changed over the years too, right? Sling TV has been out for multiple years now. So over time, has the methodology changed in terms of how you're measuring that so that you can shape traffic in real time?
Yes, it definitely has matured as we have matured. Originally, it was kind of a roll the dice 50-50 or in thirds and just let it go with what it can. And then we slowly made our clients smarter so they could actually choose. If performance wasn't good enough, then it could shift to a different CDN. That's what gives us a little bit more of our regional ability. Some CDNs serve better in one region or another, and let those clients decide. And like I said, on those bad days is when it really pays off. On a bad day, when one CDN is having a bad day, we just turn them off. And that's been probably the greatest benefit, is that we can just swing them around as needed, since as much as they all do quite well overall, you can't guarantee that you'll never have a bad day.
No, they can't. It's the nature of the internet. And it's interesting you say that, because we do hear in the industry from a lot of customers years ago, like yourselves, when they started, it was, okay, I'm just going to put 50% on this CDN and 50% on this one by volume. And it wasn't really comparing the two from a quality standpoint. It just wasn't putting all their eggs in one basket. And now, to your point, years later, the methodology has changed to the point of where you can turn it on and off real easily. Guillaume, what is the #1 challenge that you're hearing from customers in terms of when they're looking to do Origin Shield? Is it just not understanding how that ties into the rest of the multi-CDNs? What is the issue there? Because to Chris's point, and keep in mind, some of the customers we interviewed are small enough to where they wouldn't have the need, which is probably the 11%. But for those that are 25% that are considering it, what do you think is stopping them from actually implementing it?
Well, I mean, the Origin Shield is not necessarily something that you do with a multi-CDN strategy. I mean, even with only one CDN, an Origin Shield is something that is extremely valuable because, yeah, as Chris said, there may be a few issues on some days. Something goes wrong, and the CDN basically becomes a DDoS attack on your origin, which is why you have the Origin Shield. And to loop back to what Chris was saying, Sling has been in the game for quite a long time. So they started, and no offense here, you started when it was easy, and switching between CDN, was fairly easy. And as you've grown, you learned how to be more efficient and more subtle in all that. And I think this is what scares people. The fact that, okay, I have 3 CDNs, they do almost the same work in 90% of the cases, and I need to load balance between all those. And how do I do that? And the heuristics and the policies at play are a bit scary, because you are afraid of making the bad decision, and you need to make that decision for virtually every request that your user make. So I think it's people overestimate the complexity of the problem, and it's yeah, you can start small like Sling did, and then make things smarter over time as you learn how your platform reacts to different inputs.
Complexity of the unknown, not surprising for a lot of people.
Exactly.
Challenge for them. Let's go to survey question 2. So we wanted to know, because of what's going on in today's business environment, and of course we've seen a lot of shifts in terms of things like remote production. We know live sports is not in the air currently. There's some coming back, which is great, and there'll be some later in the year. So we know there are some fundamental shifts we've seen just in terms of the content choices out there and whatnot, but we also wanted to know, with what's going on in the market, the recent changes, has that forced content owners and OTT platforms to deploy or rely more on an Origin Shield product? 61% said no, almost 39% said yes. So I think the key takeaway here is just the fact that we know, to Chris's point earlier, that it is super important for customers of a certain size and scale. Obviously, it's not going to make sense for every single customer out there in terms of the type of volume that they have. To Guillaume's point, it's not just for multi-CDN, it's also just to reduce the load on Origin. So even if you're using one CDN, it makes total sense. Maybe for this one, Chris, I'll just have you jump in here if you think there's anything that stands out to you here in terms of the data.
So we didn't make any changes, just to let you know on which side we are. We observed a lot of changes, right, as viewing shifted from sports and towards news. We definitely had swings in viewership, and we saw some new viewers that we hadn't seen before, and so we had those opportunities. But in terms of the CDN and the Origin Shield, it delivered as expected, right? It just continued to work even at the new scale. We were really pleased with how stable it was.
Which is the whole reason you have it.
That's correct.
To be able to shift and handle the traffic, whether you have an issue in the market, a business challenge with COVID or whatnot, or more traffic for another potential reason, you add more channels to your lineup, it becomes more popular. I could also think, just when you guys offer promotions of some kind, higher promotions, I think about the holidays time. Sometimes you could buy a Roku or other devices and you get the service bundled with it. That's the benefit of Origin Shield, right? It's gonna grow with your service. Let's go to survey question here, 3, because there's quite a few things to take away from this one. So what are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to your multi-CDN deployment? Again, this is specific to video. So the number one here, there's 2 of them that are really tied. Measuring and monitoring QoE across multiple CDN vendors, something we've covered a little here. Scaling, delivering real-time traffic due to changes in traffic. If you look at the third, maintaining their own private or hybrid CDN. Managing multiple relationships with CDNs, not surprising, it's about 15%. Going back to what Chris said earlier, coming up with the best way to blend traffic amongst multiple third-party CDNs is just over 12%. Interestingly here, performance of video delivery across specific regions and devices is only 8.2%. I think the reason that's so low is because the quality of delivering in regions around the world has gotten a lot better, especially with so many regional service providers who, when Chris mentioned earlier, some CDNs perform better in certain countries and certain regions. And it's not necessarily a global CDN, it might be a regional CDN in a particular country. So Chris, I'll jump to you here first. Let's pick out some of the biggest challenges that they're having here. The best way to blend traffic amongst multiple third-party CDNs. You mentioned how your methodology has changed, but from a internal development resources engineering time, is there a lot of time spent there in terms of being able to maintain something that is going to blend traffic amongst multiple third-party CDNs? Because you're obviously not doing this manually, you're doing this on the fly. So to keep that going, is there a lot of dev and engineering ops requirements?
So there was originally, as we were trying to figure out the algorithms and the methods that would work for us, and we actually made it a little too complex, I would say, originally. And so the the bottom right one, the managing multiple relationships with third-party CDNs, that actually became the bigger problem. Is if as we started to customize for one specific CDN or optimize for that one, it limited how well we could move around between the CDNs. So I actually think that by keeping it a little simpler, we got more value. So our goal hasn't been to make it perfect for everyone, but to make it perfectly stable and perfectly consistent. And even though it might not be the best experience for every single customer, we feel that stability and that consistency was so much more valuable. The ability to move from one CDN to the other without having to make changes because the objects come in a different format or something like that. Anytime we had to customize a specific CDN, we got nervous and it ended up biting us eventually. So we work really hard to try to be very consistent across those CDNs so that they really are just services to us and they're not unique. And therefore our algorithms about how to blend that traffic also don't have to be as sophisticated as they might be.
That's interesting. Makes sense. So sometimes less is more. It's really what you're saying.
Yeah, it's definitely more like 90-10, right? So we're getting a lot of the benefit for a lot less of the effort.
Guillaume, let's tackle the second largest one here in terms of measuring and monitoring QoE across multiple CDN providers. When customers reach out to you and they're asking, okay, what are some of the challenges there? Chris is obviously talking about the ones they've had and saying, okay, let's not make it so complex, let's keep it simpler. But what are some of really the best practices that you tell them they have to think about as they go to figure out, okay, what is that methodology?
Yeah, so I think, and it is going to tie in with Chris' answer about consistency and having something that is logical, easy to understand and to grasp. And observability is a big question here. And I know we've left the origin shield space a little bit, but having an origin shield that is going to be the same for all the CDNs and coupling that with data from the users basically allows you to identify exactly what is going on at the CDN level. So by sandwiching basically the unknown between the user data and the origin data, you get a lot of information and you can really pinpoint where your issues are.
When the customers are asking you that, let me ask, are they typically saying we need to figure out our methodology because we're using 2 CDN vendors, or in a multi-CDN strategy, are they using, as many as Chris might be, 5, 6? What is the average there that you're seeing?
Usually we only see 2 or 3. And 2 is probably the majority here, because people want something that works most of the time, and they want a second option in case the first one doesn't work. I haven't seen too many people going with 5, 6, because usually people only need to cover the region for their audience. So they don't need to multiply the options. And yeah, as Chris said, the simpler things are, the easier they are. So right now, and it may change in the future, but right now we are seeing really a small set of CDNs in hybrid CDNs, and people are providing often their private CDN. So
got it. Okay.
And we've rarely gone to 5 because of
Okay.
that same problem. The broader you go, the more issues you have. So we usually run with 3 primary.
And what makes you go to 4 or 5?
Usually some special case, some region, some ISP, some
So
underserved.
a small sub-segment of your traffic overall.
Proportionally, yes.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it usually costs us more proportional effort.
Of course it does. And it's probably more per gig delivered in those regions or per meg sustained as well.
Mm-hmm. But we have liked having 3 though, because at the scale we're running, if one has a bad day, the other two, it's nice to have two places to go, since to have a sudden doubling of your traffic
To just one provider, yeah, right.
provider can be a scary moment.
So 3 gives you the flexibility you need.
That's right.
Yeah. Let's go to question 4 here. I think we've got 2 more questions, survey-wise, and then we're going to get into questions for the audience. So this question, how has the new business environment impacted the change in your multi-CDN strategy, specifically for video? So let's dissect this here. So 30% say they rely more on third-party CDNs. 28% rely less. 18% no impact. 17% accelerated the build out. And almost 10% say it's too early to know. So the biggest thing I'll just say, takeaway here, is it really depends on the size of the customer you're talking about, what they're delivering, where they're delivering it, live or on demand, is it regional or global? I've heard interesting things from customers of a similar size and similar verticals saying, because we're out of the office and because we put some engineering projects temporarily on hold that had to do specifically with the build out of our own private CDN or more internal resources, we're now relying more on third-party CDNs until that comes back. Then at the flip side, though, I'm also hearing from others who are saying, well, we knew that we had to do this anyway. This is only accelerating us doing it faster. So now we're going to rely less on third-party CDNs because this is kind of just forcing us to make the move. So I'm hearing both from the industry, depending on the vertical we're looking at. And I think part of that too is just based on how much businesses are now learning about different ways of doing things, especially when it comes to remotely, obviously, production, delivery, ingestion, transcoding, a lot of cloud services. So Chris, I'll throw this one at you and let you pick whatever you really want out of here in terms of what you think is most interesting.
Yeah, I was struggling to think how you would rely less on a CDN because of an event like this, unless you just had lower traffic, because no impact or more seems to apply in my mind. If your traffic's going up and your patterns are changing and you have to, and there's more and more surprises as your workload is more dynamic, it seems like those Origin Shield or CDNs, they're going to be there, sort of not masking, but shielding you, to reuse the same word, shielding you from a lot of those changes. As people shifted from watching TV in the prime time evenings and they started being home more often and they're in their homes instead of their offices, I mean, we saw changes in some of those behaviors. And because of those CDNs being so flexible, our CDN partners largely handled that component, and our internal CDNs that were providing the content to them, they almost looked identical, regardless of what the move out there did. And that's their intent. And the CDNs we work with largely delivered. I was very pleased.
Yeah, I have a feeling that when it comes to relying less on third-party CDNs, it's to your point of they have less traffic, right? So if we think sports has been taken off, if we think of some of the sports leagues, teams, they're relying less on third-party CDNs simply because they have a loss of traffic. I'm also thinking of sites that have a lot of video, like travel and hospitality. They had that sudden surge of traffic in March with cancellations and whatnot, but then all of a sudden they don't have a lot of traffic there because people aren't visiting them. So I think to your point, I think it's people answering that question who simply have less traffic. Guillaume, what have you heard from customers, if anything, in terms of how they're looking at the pandemic regarding these questions?
So we've definitely seen an uptick of people trying to, well, either implement an Origin Shield or their own private solution. The important thing to realize is that a CDN is going to divide the traffic that you're getting. But if so, you have a traffic reduction, really. But if the traffic that the CDN is getting is so massive that it still DDoS your Origin, you're still dead in the water, which is why people are starting to implement their own Origin Shield to prevent from the CDN DDoSing them. So we've definitely seen a rise of these cases, and people, while they're at it, because they have an Origin that is so powerful, they started pushing that as their own private CDN. On the other side, we had people who were already using multiple CDNs. And I think this is where, yeah, we have that confusion between, okay, some people rely more on it, some people rely less on that hybrid CDN approach. But once you're already using multiple CDNs, it's really just a cursor that you need to shift. Chris said very justly that adding a fifth, a sixth CDN means you have more balls to juggle with, but at the same time, switching from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 or back down, it's not that big. So a lot of people have realized that, well, the CDNs they have are doing the job fairly well. So they don't actually need that many. So I think it's really just.
I think that's a good point. Sorry to jump in. I think that's a really good point you bring up. CDNs have been doing such a better job over the last 5 or 6 years. So to your point, the quality is so good. It's not the days where we saw people using 7 to 8 CDNs because they really had different quality amongst all of them. So to your point, they need fewer CDNs. To Chris's point, 3 is the max they need. That way, if one went down completely, he still has 2.
Exactly. So yeah, what you may be seeing here is people going from 2 to 3 and 4 or 5 back to 3. And people may also, I mean, I've heard that from a few customers that they were really dreading that pandemic because, yeah, it means more traffic, and they are not sure how the CDNs are going to react. And after the fact, well, actually it went very well. So there may have been some anxiety about, okay, how the CDNs are going to perform, and then when put under pressure, they delivered. So yeah, it may also have been the opportunity to adjust the expectations and the reality. That may be a factor why you're having those two. Okay, we rely more, we rely less.
Could be, yeah, could be. Let's jump to question 5. What are the 3 top factors that influence you the most when choosing your third-party CDNs? So when you're choosing CDN providers in the market, why are you picking one over the other? I'll call out some things real quick. Price, 9.2%. There are some people in this industry that think this is just about who has the lowest cost and they're going to win. It's not what this is about. This is not a race to the bottom. Yes, it was 6, 7 years ago, but today Sling TV and many other companies are actually getting revenue from these services. It's important to their business. The QoE has to be good. If it's not good, they have churn, they lose customers, they want frictionless sign up. So yes, they all want an affordable price, but this is not just about who has the lowest price in the market. And that's why top 3 factors, price was only 10%. So the top 3, let's take a look here, are features and functionality of CDN offering. Makes sense. They have to support what you're looking to deliver. Then contract flexibility and specific performance metrics. So Chris, I'll start with you on this one. You don't necessarily have to pick from here, but what are the most important things that you're looking at from your third-party CDNs when you're negotiating and looking who to pick?
Sure. So we kind of go through a few things. First, we look at the geo. Do they meet the geo that we need? And in our case, it's all the United States. So if that's the first break. The next cut is, do they have a common set of minimum functions? Like, will they be able to meet the needs of what we need without having to get too fancy, not too custom, as absolutely common minimum as possible. Now, by minimum, I don't mean we don't want them to do a lot for us, but I mean, here are these 5 features, we need those. If you have those, okay, then you're on the candidate list. Then we would choose by performance. And so who's giving the best quality of experience? And assuming that they're all meeting a minimum set of performance metrics, we won't always choose the one that's giving the absolute literal best. As long as they're meeting a minimum performance level, then we would sometimes use cost as our final decision. So if I have 2 CDNs and they're both providing about the same level of service to the same geographies, we will favor the one that's cheaper as just a good business practice. Now, we're regularly monitoring that performance, and as performance shifts, we swing it back. And that honestly is my favorite part about working with the CDNs, is you pay what you get. You pay for what you get. And right. So if a given CDN has a bad day or has a bad month or a bad year, you stop paying them. And if somebody's doing really, really well, you continue to move more and more traffic in their direction. So they are competing on a day-to-day and hourly basis, and we partner with them to try to help them all be successful as we're successful. But at the end of the day, we'll follow whoever's providing the best service, and that's probably the best part about the multi-CDN, is that we can help our customers and give them as much as possible because of that flexibility.
Which makes sense. And we saw this a couple years ago in the industry, maybe even more than a couple, where customers like yourselves and others would only commit a portion of their overall traffic to 2 or 3 different CDNs. So maybe they commit 20% to one and 20% to another. And then the other CDNs would have to compete based on performance every day for the other 60% of their traffic.
Right.
And that was a great thing for the industry, because to your point, it made CDNs want to work with their customers to make sure that they optimized for better QoE so that they could win more of your business. So I like the fact that you as a customer and others have made the CDNs, I don't want to say fight each other, but just work really hard to provide a better end user experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the vendors actually take it as a real challenge to improve their service and to work with us, and others don't love it as much, but most of them are really open to the idea. Great, what is it we need? Let's go make it better. And it's probably worth noting that we rarely turn a CDN to zero, because we do try to keep all the CDNs having some portion so that they stay somewhat warm in terms of having a fair amount of the content, so that if we do need to swing to them, we're not starting from scratch.
Makes sense. Okay. And then you also continue to collect data in terms of seeing how they're performing, as opposed to stopping that completely.
Exactly.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's go into the Q&A here. We want to get to whatever questions you may have for us. Please put it into the chat here, into the questions. If your question isn't answered during the event, we will get you an answer offline once the event's over. Also, the recording and survey data, as I mentioned, that's going to be shared after the presentation. So you'll receive a follow-up email from Varnish, and I'll give you links to where you can do that. So I have a couple questions here already in the system. Let me take a quick look at these. So Chris, I'm going to go to you on this one, because this is a question I also wrote down myself that somebody else wrote in here. Is earlier you said that you want the CDNs to have a minimum performance level. And so this person is asking, what are those minimum performance levels? But I'm going to sort of reword that a little different way and saying, how do you know what your viewers expect from a minimum performance level? Because one of the problems we have in the industry is no OTT service we've ever seen in the industry has ever shared any data or given any insight into what actually causes churn, what helps with retention. And we all know the industry will go, oh, well, the video has to start up quickly, right? We know that. We know if it doesn't start up fast, that's not great. But what we don't know is it has to start up slowly twice or 10 times before somebody cancels. So obviously don't go into whatever details you can, but what do viewers expect from that minimum performance level?
Yeah, I won't be revealing any data today either. But what the users expect is they want it to be as if they're playing their DVD player, right? They want it to be immediate. They want it to be high quality, consistent, reliable. And in the world of internet, it's actually pretty surprising how close we do get. The question is that half of 1% that have the trouble, right? So I believe that the challenge that we have, and that will differentiate us from others, is not that we generally deliver well. I think it's going to come down to that small percentage of people who we have issues. How small a group can we make that? And so when I say the performance characteristics of the CDN, we've actually built up an experience with each of the different CDNs and with what is possible, sort of state of the art today. And those are the metrics I'm saying when we adjust. We combine our personal metrics that we get from our own personal players to the metrics provided by the CDNs. And you have to be careful with some of those, because sometimes they're not all calculated exactly the same. So to get an apples to apples, it's nice that you have your own statistics as well to sort of calibrate those. But the end user is really the key and the goal here. And And it's also the trick, because when you're trying to provide a macro solution for a micro problem in a given particular person's their individual Roku, on their individual Wi-Fi system, on their individual ISP, there's only so many things we can solve from a CDN perspective, from a make the content available, make it close to the customer. In many ways, it's going to come down to not just could you get the content to them, but how does your player handle that? How do you buffer it? How do you minimize the impact? How do you choose which bit rate? Those are really in my opinion, the more important parts. The CDN is becoming so stable, consistent, and are there opportunities to improve? For sure. But the bigger wins, I suspect, will be on those players, those clients.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point, because you don't make the hardware that's being delivered to. You don't make the platforms, so you have to work with all those.
And we control so little of the network beyond the CDN. I mean, our relationship is with the CDN, who has a relationship with ISPs, but even inside of individual homes, they don't care whether they overloaded their network. They just know that Sling had a bad experience, or whichever other product they might be using.
Right,
So we try to control what we can control and learn if there are opportunities other places, but to think that we'll ever be able to control all of those experiences it's aspirational.
It's unrealistic. I'll take a stronger term. It's unrealistic, but all great points that you bring up. Guillaume, question for you here. We were talking earlier just in terms of how you're picking and choosing multi-CDNs, and obviously it's different based on the customer and a lot of factors, just like Chris is talking about. There's a lot of different pieces here in the workflow. Some that can and can't be controlled by a single company, most that can't. When you're talking to customers, though, who are asking about specific differences per region, is it easier to implement a multi-CDN strategy if you're only trying to do that, say, in, I don't know, Russia or Brazil, right? If it's down to a country level, does that make it easier?
That's a great question. It really depends. I mean, the country is probably the bad unit, a bad unit to think about that problem, because it's really going to depend on geography, but also network links, because you may be closer to a POP, but the link that is going to take you there is going to be bad quality. And I've seen customers going through 1 or 2 extra hops to get better quality. So, ultimately, and I think Chris pointed at that just for the previous question, get the information from the users, because the user is going to tell you, okay, what is fast. If you have a way for the user to test different POPs, for example, or different CDNs, do that, because ultimately what you are going to predict from your central control is going to be different from what the user is seeing, and the user is ultimately the person you're catering to. So this is what you should do, but you don't necessarily have to go that bad. You can also make simple decision based on, okay, if you're in Russia, then go for the Russian POPs. It makes no sense going for the American ones, for example. So you can start small, you can go complex, but as much as possible, base your information on the user data, if you can.
So I've got one follow-up question for both of you, and then we're going to be out of time. If we don't get to your question again, just shoot us an email afterwards. You can see my email here, mail@rayburn.com. I'm happy to forward the email along to Chris as well, or Guillaume. So Guillaume, a follow-up question for you then. You're talking about test data, which is a good point. Do you recommend that customers get test accounts on CDNs and actually put some traffic over them for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I don't know, a month, so that they can actually look at what the QoE is and they can compare some of the CDN performance before they actually start pushing a lot of traffic over them?
Absolutely. Try, test. And I mean, CDNs are such large entities. I mean, unless you send 1 million more requests when you're actually in production, chances are the test is actually going to, or the trial or the free account is going to give you a good idea of what's going on. So absolutely, CDNs are getting cheaper and cheaper. There are trials all across the board. So absolutely, try it. And if you already have that logic to go from one CDN to another, well, it's just, and I'm beginning scare quotes here because Chris told us about that, but it's just adding another CDN to the mix. So, and even if you only send like 0.1% of your traffic, that is still good data that you can gather.
Yeah, it's a good point. Test beforehand. So one more question, Chris. I'm going to have you close it out. I'm going to take a little bit of a broader approach here with this question. I don't want to lose the opportunity to ask you because Sling is obviously seeing just a lot of interesting use of the service, right? With all the things going on. So I just want to ask you more of a general question. Is there anything unique that you've seen in all your data over the last 3 months, and not about QoE or CDNs, but just about viewership, particular types of content people are watching, or maybe they're watching on different devices? Is there anything because of the pandemic that you've seen has shifted or changed with user consumption?
So yeah, the biggest part was switching from sports to news. I mean, when there's no sports, and we do almost entirely live TV, and live sports and live news are the most popular for sure. And so when there's no sports, well, people can only watch cornhole on ESPN for as long.
Yeah,
they won't watch
true.
as long as they want to. So, and no offense to cornhole players, it's a fun game. So there was definitely that shift. There were also some shifts of time of day viewing, and interestingly, the reality TV shows. I think there
Reality TV, really? Huh.
There must have been a little bit of escapism. I mean,
Oh,
that's
okay, yeah.
my interpretation of that. But the reality TV hung in there, hung strong, and was a pretty popular option for a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to shift to news. I also wondered after a period of time where people just had enough of the news and they're tired and they're still looking for some live content but can't really find it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It was bigger when it first started happening. People have shifted away from news. I'm sure there was some news is hard to watch.
True. Well, we've got sports coming back little by little, right? Golf has started. Baseball's now going to be coming back supposedly next month, now they're saying. So
Yeah, we're
slowly
excited
but
for it.
surely. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'd certainly like to thank Chris and Guillaume for joining us today. I'd like to thank Varnish for allowing me to moderate and help them collect this information. And if you joined the webinar late, you will receive a follow-up email from Varnish so you can see an archive of the webinar, and also they will provide a link of where you can download for free all the recording and survey data. We have that in a PDF with key takeaways, so you can see not just the 5 or 6 questions we asked here answered here, but all the questions, because I think looking at all the questions combined gives you a better holistic view of what we're looking at. So if you have any additional questions, please do feel free to send me an email, send one to Varnish right here. We'll make sure that I pass them on to Sling if you have one for Chris. We'd like to thank you for joining us today. Any other questions, follow up. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next webinar. Stay safe. We'll see you again. Thank you.